big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leese.
Well, hello, everybody. It's July 11, 2024, the year of our Lord. It's David Leese here, your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier. Did you know that manufacturing, business, is actually a central foundational part of this country? Well, we're going to talk about business and doing business in Canada today, its challenges, and strategically how we can move our country forward. And I want to encourage you as our audience to keep the comments coming. We receive so many comments right across the country, and we really do appreciate them. And I encourage you to continue to care about our country. Just because it's the time of summer doesn't mean that we stop paying attention to what's going on in this nation. There's so many issues that are going on, and we're certainly going to be touching a lot of those things today. We have a very special guest. Her name is Catherine Swift. You may have heard of her. She has a long history of playing a significant leadership role in terms of public policy in our country, and certainly speaking on behalf. She's a very articulate voice in terms of standing up for business in our country, and I think Canadians as well. So I want to welcome Catherine Swift to our program. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you. Happy to be here. And thank you for that nice introduction.
Well, Catherine, you deserve it. You've had a long history with not only the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, but also you're the current president of a very interesting coalition. In fact, you call it the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Business in Canada. So can you tell us more about what that coalition is all about, Catherine?
Yeah, sure. We haven't been around very long. We're a relatively new organization. And it was initially just manufacturers, but then I think a lot of other businesses related to our mission, which is multifold. I will mention in a minute, and therefore we sort of expanded it to outside of the manufacturing sector, and so basically we have now a mix of business members, still predominantly manufacturing, but I think the manufacturing sector is undervalued in Canada. Certainly, it's undervalued with many of our current governments. But it is a hugely important sector for all kinds of different reasons. And as an organization, we are probably pretty unique in Canada for never accepting 1 red cent of government money.
Not red, 1 red cent?
I may be wrong. Yes, not even 1 cent.
Okay.
I may be wrong, but it's very unfortunate. And I don't think enough people really recognize this. And it's not just a Canadian phenomena. I talk to businesses in the US, same deal. Business organizations end up getting compromised because the government will say, oh, hey, we'll give you $1 million to offer this training program for us, or whatever it happens to be. And I know many business organizations that actually get more than half of their revenue from various government sources. And once that happens, you can be sure that if the government comes out with some horrid policy that's really bad for, it's the members of the organization, then they're probably not going to say much about it because they would compromise their own existence, their own paychecks. So that is something that we're pretty determined about to avoid that. We also, mind you, have a very national focus. We want to maintain good jobs in Canada, and manufacturing jobs are typically very good jobs, well-paying, good benefits, solid jobs. And something else that might be a little different for a business organization is we're very supportive of freedom, whether it's free speech, whether it's freedom of rights, all the things that are supposedly enshrined in our Constitution, and yet we don't often see them in reality. So that's something else we think is valuable, and that's not just a random kind of thing that we like. When you look around the world, these successful democracies, successful economies are relatively free. Of course, there's no perfect freedom, and there have to be constraints on certain things, definitely. But to have a successful small and medium-sized independent business community, to have a successful democratic system, freedom is a key component. If you do away with it, you're dealing with banana republic kind of situations. So that's, to us, a very integral part.
Well, I like the way you're thinking, Catherine, as usual. I've heard your voice many times as you articulate the importance of business and manufacturing to our country. But also it's interesting how you make the the dot connection to our culture, to freedom, in fact. So I think you're right on in terms of those themes. And so we want to use your expertise today to explore that here on the Frontier. And so to our audience, we welcome your questions to Catherine as we discuss this important topic about our economy and business. We want to welcome your thoughts. So make sure you pose them, whether you're on YouTube or X or any other platform. We want to hear from you today. So Catherine, just to step back for a moment, I mean, there's a lot of interesting business organizations in our country. So why a new one? You're the president of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses in Canada. Why was it important to form a new association in your mind?
Well, the real reason it was formed, and I wasn't around when it was formed, by the way. One of my colleagues, Jocelyn Bamford, who is still the chair,
Yes, right.
was the woman, and she is the vice president of a manufacturing company. Her husband is the president, so it's a family affair, a very successful company. But Jocelyn started it because what she saw was too many co-opted business organizations, exactly as I mentioned before.
Interesting.
They were, as the old saying goes, going along to get along. And again, if a government proposed a horrendous policy, they would maybe say something about it, but it wouldn't be the kind of strenuous opposition that those kind of policies really deserved. So she really felt that particular number of attributes, and the freedom thing is important to that as well, but that those attributes were not being fulfilled by the current, and you're right, there's a ton of business organizations in Canada, but too many have become dependent on government and therefore are not accurately representing the views of the businesses that often belong to them. And I think one thing that's really important too that people should realize, and this is particularly true with our current federal government, is that when they consult these business groups that are subsidized by government and therefore likely to be co-opted, they can then turn around to business and say, oh, but we consulted the business community. We already talked to you guys, but no, they did not. What they talked to were their buddies. I think that recent example that came up with Trudeau having that little tete-a-tete with the so-called generation squeeze, which we're talking about, that it's not technically a business issue, but it's related to business issues on our, capital gains tax on our principal residences. Not an accident that they're a government-funded organization. So do you think they're really going to say something that Trudeau didn't like? Of course they're not.
So let's just slow down for a sec, because people may have missed this. This is a bombshell revelation. Yeah. The Trudeau government has been undertaking focus group discussions, we understand, to introduce a new policy that would tax the equity on your home. Is that what you're referring to, Catherine?
Yeah, that's absolutely, and it's been in the press for the last. It was quite recent. It was about a week ago, I think, and it's been fairly prominent in some of the media. It still is. I think it's the third rail of politics in Canada, because that one is something that so many people depend on. That they don't work for government. They don't have those cushy pensions that we all pay for, but we do not enjoy collecting when we retire. And so many Canadians very rightfully view things like their principal residence as something for their retirement. And to touch that is, to my mind, unconscionable. People do their financial planning over decades, if they have any brains. They do.
But they're still pecking away at it. There's been a lot of interesting things. There's been, I recall last year, a report that was commissioned to look at the policy measures that could be taken and the benefits financially of taxing the equity on your home. I mean, this is unbelievable, because this government, as you know, has spent more money than all previous federal governments combined. A lot of Canadians are not aware of just the sheer magnitude of money going out the door in terms of deficits and accumulated debt. But in this case, you're saying that there was a kind of these are my words, but kind of a full business group that was consulted on that very issue of taxing your home equity. And it's kind of confusing to people.
Yeah, it's not a business group. It's a group that technically, supposedly, and I really have many doubts about the legitimacy of this group at all. I think it's a government-created group to say what the government wants to hear and pretend that it's some independent group that supposedly represents young people, hence the name Generation Squeeze. The Taxpayers Federation, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, created an entity a number of years ago called Generation Screwed, which absolutely is legitimate young people who are looking at people, or sorry, looking at issues that affect people, younger people, and millennials, generation X, generation Z now, and so on. But this particular group sounds to me like a phony baloney group that was created with government money to say what the government wants to hear, and then they can pretend, oh, we consulted these young people, and the intergenerational equity is so awful that we have to punish these old people. But there's a lot of boomers out there in our population, and what I find weird from a political standpoint here is that when you look at public opinion polls, an awful lot of the people that continue to want to vote Liberal, and we know those numbers are shrinking by the day, as they well should, given how this government's treated Canadians, but a lot of their support is with older people. So I'm thinking, are you nuts? You want to annoy this older generation, who are one of the few groups that still vote, not universally, but you know what I mean, still significantly vote for you? Well, what are you drinking or smoking or whatever? Because it makes zero sense to me. But the point you mentioned earlier, though, was very germane, in that this government can't control its spending. That's clear. It can't control its spending. I've seen all kinds of evidence that the actual state of our finances in Canada is way worse than they are saying, and they're bad enough with what they're saying. I believe they're much worse, and once they're out of government, we will see the truth, and it's going to be really ugly. And yet they can't seem to control it. They waste money. We see money wasted on a daily basis by this government. They appoint people that are totally inappropriate for their positions. It's like, can't you learn anything? Can't you learn any efficiencies in your operations? And you would only be looking at something as serious as taxing principal residence equity if you don't have a clue about the need to control spending. And of course, we're running up debt. You want to talk about intergenerational equity? The real problem here is that we have such a horrible deficit. It's the younger people, their kids, and their kids that are going to be paying for it. So the notion that they're making intergenerational equity way worse than it ever was before they came along, and then they want to throw a few bones in minor little things like a few $1 billion taxing, principal residence equity. To me, it's just so incredibly stupid that it's hard to figure what they're thinking, other than the destruction of this country, which is something I've come to believe is not an accident because of their ineffectiveness and inefficiency, but it's deliberate.
Okay, wow. So that is quite a summation, Catherine Swift. So we're going to try to peel this layers of the onion, as we say here on the frontier, and try to get at these things, because there's a lot of issues going on in our country, and there's a lot of common themes. It's been said that Canada's broken. At the same time, we're kind of on a decline in terms of productivity and standard of living. At the same time, we all know that we live in an incredible country with incredible people and opportunity. So I want to unpack a number of these things with your kind help. And one of them has to do with the bottom line. What is it like for people to try to manufacture all kinds of widgets in this country that we rely on to make our lives move forward? We take a lot of this stuff for granted every day. Every Canadian is impacted by manufacturers and business, period. I mean, either we're employed by them or we rely on them for mission critical things. They're the people who deliver goods. They're the people who make them. So what is it like to run a business and manufacture in this country today, Catherine?
Well, it's pretty bad overall. I would have to say, though, one thing to keep in mind with the manufacturing sector is that all we ever hear about is autos. When you don't talk about manufacturing, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Autos. Mm-hmm. And, congratulations to the auto sector. They have been very successful at getting the attention of governments. And, and I think, as a result, they have attracted tons of money, tons of subsidy money that they're taking from the taxes paid by other businesses that don't need the subsidies because they're operating their business in a smart way. And any business that needs constant subsidies, which the auto sector does, and we can look historically, they seem to need money every few years. They need a few billion more here. And this latest EV subsidy business, if you ask me, is going to be the biggest fiasco.
Sorry, EVs, you mean electric?
EVs,
you mean electric vehicles?
Electric vehicles. Yes, they're going to be the biggest disaster that we have ever seen in terms of subsidies. Already, we're almost we're over $50 billion in terms of planned subsidies to that sector. And we see demand declining out there. We see all kinds of issues that do not bode well for the future of that sector. So, and that's just one example. We've seen the industry bailed out time and time again because it can't seem to operate itself properly. However,
but just to clear, Catherine, so the policy environment for manufacturing and businesses in Canada is bad, period. But would there be a lot of agreement on that?
It's not for autos because they keep sucking off the taxpayers' dime. But yeah. The problem with that is less than 10% of the manufacturing sector is automotive. 90+% is non-automotive, and it of course is a wide array of machining, like you say, widgets. I mean, not widgets per se, but manufacturing all manner of things, fasteners, plastic products. So there's a ton of different things, and overall, it's a highly productive sector. When you compare it to other sectors, well-paying jobs, as I mentioned earlier, and one that we want to keep in Canada because it's an innovative sector. And when you have innovation, then you have R&D, you have all those things that we want to have in Canada. We don't just want to be buying these nice high-end products from other jurisdictions, which is what we're heading toward. Something that I'll say, which is interesting in our organization, is we have a board of about a dozen people. Other than myself, they're all running manufacturing or similar businesses. And about 5 years ago, none of them had an operation south of the border. Today, half of them do. And the stories you hear about how welcoming the U.S. I know this is a bit of a cliche, but I think it needs to be said. The U.S. views business and views profitability as a good thing. We have Jagmeet Singh in our federal parliament right now talking about profitability as evil. It's greedy. It's funny when the unions ask for ridiculous raises, like apparently the WestJet guys just got 30% increase over 5 years. It's never greedy for them. It's only greedy for these businesses that actually create jobs, create wealth, pay gobs of taxes, and do innovative things in our country. So, that wrong-headed view of the Jagmeet Singhs, and I think Trudeau's the same. Trudeau, no clue about business, no clue about how you actually grow an economy. They just want to take from one group, and whether it's homeowners with their equity or whether it's the so-called rich, which, as we know, if you know anything about history, so-called rich taxes have never worked in the history of the world. Many have tried it. France is going to apparently do it again now, which should be another entertaining experiment to watch, but it won't be very good for France.
Okay. So Catherine, are you saying that essentially we're with a set of government actors, certainly at the federal level, it varies from province to province, but we've got a series of decision makers that are essentially against the private sector and business.
Oh, very much so. Well, look at the growth we've seen in government under Trudeau, for example, 40% increase and it's still growing. I looked at the labor force data for last month, for June, just came out last week. The public sector, and it's not just federally, mind you, the federal is the biggest chunk, but some provinces continue to grow like crazy as well. So whenever you have the sector that is actually consuming wealth, so-called, overproducing it, growing faster, then you've got I call it the Grecian formula, because that's what happened to Greece years ago. Was that the government was growing like mad. Everybody was retiring at 50, living till 80, collecting a pension, this kind of stuff that is just financially unsustainable.
Okay, so in this context, then, we've got kind of a train wreck of public policy that's impacting Canadians. I think we see this in the stats, as you've alluded to, in terms of investment flowing out of the country. We've got a declining standard of living. And I want to share with you, Catherine, and the audience a clip about Canada's declining or productivity challenge. I think we've all heard the quote from the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, Carolyn Rogers, who used, I think, a powerful analogy of breaking the so-called emergency glass on the issue of productivity.
With construction robots Promise Robotics is at the crossroads of the housing crisis and AI and understands the value in investing in productivity.
What's $1 per square foot you spend, and like a holistic view, and start to look at how you can monetize over the years, then you've got a pretty good business case to be able to actually invest in your productivity.
But many businesses are hesitant to invest, part of the complex web of declining productivity, with other factors including a large increase in immigration and global tensions.
In Ontario now, people make the same as they make in Alabama. We're falling behind all G7 countries. We're falling behind the United States. And in Finland, they make the same as us. They work less. So they're working smarter.
In an emergency, break the glass. Well, it's time to break the glass.
That's the senior deputy governor of the Bank of Canada in a recent speech, talking about our productivity problem. To explain what it really means, Carolyn Rogers used a very Canadian analogy. The same number of workers working the same number of hours will clear more snow with solid shovels that don't break. They'll be even more productive if given snow blowers. But for the most cleared driveways, invest in snowplows. Budget 2024 promises about $7 billion to boost productivity, the bulk going to AI and research investments. But will it work?
Entirely counterproductive to what they're trying to achieve.
The business community is frustrated by the new capital gains tax increase because when there's investment hesitancy, new taxes don't help. The government disagrees.
It will support investments in growth and productivity that will pay dividends for years to come.
Surprised, curious, shocked, dismayed people are that they would choose to go down that path.
It's not helpful to necessarily see capital gains taxation at this exact moment.
With some economists, too, questioning the timing of a new tax increase in an era of lagging productivity. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
So there you have it, a summary of Canada's so-called productivity crisis. How can we turn this around, Catherine?
Well, for starters, what I just mentioned prior to the clip there, which is very interesting, is growth of government. Growth of government does not add productivity to an economy; it detracts from it. It competes for workers with the private sector. The private sector is the productive part that adds wealth, doesn't take it away as government does. So the more you have government growing faster than the productive sector, the private sector, you're going to have your productivity declining. And that's what's happened. We also have, of course, sidelined one of our key industries, the oil and gas industry. This government has decided to squelch it, basically. And that sector tends to represent, again, it varies a little bit from year to year, but it's about 10% of our GDP. So the largest individual sector that contributes to the economy, we are shelving. We've been shelving for the last number of years. We know we've missed massive liquid natural gas opportunities around the world. We've actually had leaders from other countries, as you know. Germany, Japan came to Canada and said, we'd really like your LNG, your liquid natural gas. But no, we can't have that because we have to deal with the climate. And what I find perverse is that if we replace coal in China, in India, in a lot of other places with liquid natural gas, it would be good for the climate. So my theory, as it's evolved with my cynical political hat on, is that Alberta and Saskatchewan, who are the major players in our provinces along these lines, do not vote for Liberals, so they must be punished. And many people have said if we had a big oil and gas industry in Quebec, it would be a different story. And I tend to think there's a fair bit of truth to that. But we have damaged so much of our industry. And let's not forget too, Trudeau's made an idiot of himself on the world stage so many times we've lost count. I think his early time of socks display was probably his best foreign policy success.
Socks.
Special socks, that he was actually shown people, shown leaders and they must have thought, who is this weirdo? But anyhow, that's not good for Canada either. We know investors, productivity is also a function of investment, foreign investment. People don't want to go near Canada because they don't have certainty about our rules. They keep changing all the time. We recently had one of our big annual dinners and we had two premiers there. We had Premier Scott Moe from Saskatchewan, and we had Premier Blaine Higgs from New Brunswick, both of whom are working hard to try to keep their businesses and therefore good jobs and therefore good tax revenues for governments and therefore good public services in Canada. And, you know, it was very interesting. Scott Moe in particular made some very interesting remarks. He said, all we need in Canada is certainty. And that sounds simplistic, but that was actually quite profound, because the uncertainty, that it is the bane of business. It's the bane of investment. People will not invest in Canada if they think they have to wait 8 or 9 years for a permit. And that's actually happening. They won't invest if they think the rules are going to change tomorrow and take away any success from the business that they want to invest in. They won't create those good jobs. They won't be paying money to governments so that our public services are better. And the other thing that's happened because of massive government spending is our dollar has depreciated, and we have inflation problems, as you well know. And then a lot of the world had inflation problems, but we've had them persist in Canada because more government spending means a depreciated dollar, which in turn, we import a lot into Canada. The price of those imports goes up, and therefore further feeds inflation. So that's what we've seen too. And that, of course, is contributing to all of our, like the productivity thing. A lot of people think, oh, it's some weird economic concept that, I don't understand. Yeah. But what it means for your average person is their standard of living. So when our productivity declines, your standard of living declines. You're paying more for food. You can't afford as much of it. You suddenly have a higher interest rates. You're struggling. And boy, that's going to be a big impact on Canada in the next year or so. A lot of people, I've seen anywhere from 50, 60% of mortgage holders are going to have to renew. And in some instances, it'll mean a doubling in their mortgage payments monthly. Who can afford that? Who can afford to just face a doubling of mortgage payments literally overnight? That's ludicrous.
No,
so
you're right.
This kind of stuff is all related.
So these issues matter to Canadians. When you have that kind of decline in standard of living, this has a big impact. In fact, I think that reference was made to about a $20,000 differential now between Canadians, say in Ontario, is the same income now in terms of family as Alabama. Yeah, and no offense to Alabama, it's an incredible state, but we're seeing massive drops in standard of living, and that affects people's choices that they can make in terms of their families and the well-being of them. This has a huge impact in driving more people into poverty. I think we've seen a lot of reports and analysis on literally millions of people in Canada joining the ranks of people below. Like they're just hanging on in terms of their lives. So this issue matters. So I just want to remind the audience that I'm talking with President Catherine Swift. She's the president of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses in Canada. So what do you think about this issue? And if I can just, note, Catherine, that certainly at Frontier, we talk a lot about kind of the key principles of prosperity. So this is really not a partisan issue. And you've alluded to them. It's important to have a strong currency, to have open and fair trade, to have low or sensible regulations so that people can do business, have consistency in terms of the rule of law as an example, and low tax environments. So when we look at these types of policies, we know that they're a successful formula for prosperity across the world, really. And yet we seem to have a political class that too often, some get it, but many don't get it. So why is that, Catherine? Is it because they're simply unaware, or they come from a socialist philosophy where they don't want to get it? They think that money grows on trees. Why the disconnect? Because this is hurting Canadians. This is hurting our future of our kids. And yet they go ahead, I would argue, recklessly with this short-term thinking. So why the disconnect, Catherine? What's your theory on that?
Well, I don't think it's a theory. I think it's a fact. They're ignorant. They do not have, look at this particular federal cabinet, if you want. They're all activists. We have a finance minister who is a journalist, and nothing against journalists, but it's a whole different skill set we're talking about here. We have people in these positions that are basically activists. Look at Guilbeault in the environment. No factual understanding. I mean, he's actually been spanked by the courts, thankfully, on stupid things like saying plastics were toxic. They tried to classify plastics as toxic under our environmental legislation, which is just scientifically no, it's scientifically wrong. There's no science to back that up. So we've got people making decisions that haven't a clue what they're doing. That clip you played just and Friedland talking about all these business people are saying increasing the capital gains tax will kill investment. It'll hurt our economy further. It'll damage our productivity. Therefore, it'll lower our standard of living. It'll hit everybody where they live. And yet she says we don't agree. So in other words, we don't agree with the people that actually know something about this. So what are you saying?
Right.
You're saying that we are happy in our ignorance, I guess. But it is ideology. I think you're quite right. It's ideology. But I think an important part too is self-interest. You look at Trudeau. He is a trust fund guy. He's never had to worry about meeting a mortgage payment, paying his rent, putting food on the table for his kids, like a lot of Canadians have over, forever. And so if it doesn't hit you, I saw something recently, and it was some economist talking, and it was actually Warren Buffett who said that he felt if you had a law that said if you ran a government deficit, you could not run for re-election, you'd find an awful lot of politicians suddenly not running deficits anymore. Self-interest. Look at our politicians. They continue to give themselves raises while Canadians are suffering. And I mean, the absolute disconnect there is unbelievable. But what gets me really, and again, of course, I'm biased. I've got my own biases, no question about that. But how can people continue to vote for that? And I've been very critical of governments of other political stripes too, for what it's worth. This isn't a partisan issue. It's a policy issue. And when I see people look at the current Liberal government, which can't seem to get anything right ever, and bollockses up things as simple, or what should be not that complicated, to have a new human rights commissioner that doesn't have a long history of anti-Semitism and horrible racism. And we've had a few examples of that. That's just the more recent one, I guess. If they can't even get stuff like that right, how can anybody vote for this garbage? And that's what does continue to amaze me. We're finally seeing public opinion turn against them. I think it took way longer than it should have. And yet, and we have a media problem too. Let's not forget. I think the smartest thing the Liberals did, because there's a very short list of smart things they did. But I think number one was they subsidized the media. And not all media, naturally, but the so-called legacy mainstream media, so on. And they effectively muzzled them. And I don't care what any of those media people say. They are not telling the truth. They are just not covering certain stories that would make the Liberals look bad. And I know their industry's in trouble. Yes, their old model that used to work for them, technology has ruined it. And that's happened to many. It doesn't mean you don't have sympathy for the people whose jobs are at risk, but that's happened to, I always like to say, are we going to bring back Blockbuster Video too? Because the technology eliminated that model, or, and it's unfortunate that that's reality. And it's been happening forever. It's been happening for centuries. So, there needs to be a better path for the media for sure, and a transition, but subsidy, no wonder Canadians don't trust the media, and we depend on media. Media is such a hugely important role. So we're not getting the true story. Those of us who live our lives normally, go to work every day, want to feed our family, want to send our kids to education properly, and so on. We're not getting the true facts from them, and that in part explains why people's voting, because that's going to affect how people vote. If they don't know the truth, then that's going to affect their voting patterns, and that's why one reason I think it took so long for Canadians to realize this government is hurting them, not helping them.
Wow. So, Catherine, to be clear, then the media plays, as you said, a very important role in our democracy. You cited earlier in our conversation the importance of our culture, the freedom to critique things as we're on this journey of truth. We have healthy debate in Canada. That's part of what has allowed Canada to thrive, is you want to have healthy debate. So in the case of the media, we know that some 2,000 outlets are heavily subsidized now by this government. In fact, I think the recent 2024 budget even increased it even further. So you're saying that that's a big problem for business.
Yep. Oh, it's a big problem for the economy and therefore for business. And when you have negative business policies, presented by governments, then and you don't have that reported on, then you're not going to get a government that at least is somewhat friendly to business.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. So, again, I'm talking with Catherine Swift about the state of our economy and business. And one of the questions I have is, why is it that business seems to be reluctant to invest in more automation or AI? Or is that true, Catherine?
Well, I think some are, but I think we could see a lot more of it. Again, I get back to that certainty thing. If they had confidence that the environment was going to be good for them to grow their business while invest, because investing is expensive, right? You're spending a lot of money. So I believe if we had that certainty, we would have a lot less, would have a lot more investment because people could count on their future as a business.
Exactly. So that makes a lot of sense. I do also have another question, and that is, why are we not privatizing all these crown corporations that don't pay taxes?
Well,
I think that refers to the liquor stores and airports and all kinds of things that Canadians, it's overwhelming. I think there's thousands of crown corporations that could easily be run by the private sector. Why do our government decision makers, why are they reluctant to privatize these companies? They could increase their productivity. In fact, at Frontier, I know there's been a lot of analysis about that, but that's the question. Why don't we privatize those companies, including the liquor stores? As one example.
Ideology. Enough Canadians have been convinced. Yeah, enough Canadians have been convinced that they're good for us. Oh, it's good, it's better if the government runs it, which of course, once again, if you look at the facts, if you look at history, they always say, yeah, let's have government run it. They always do such a great job.
Right.
And of course, a lot of it is accountability. Like if you want to sort of get under, look at our federal public service right now. It's terrible. You look at things like ArriveCan, and there's probably a zillion ArriveCans we haven't even heard about yet. This is another thing I think, once this government is turfed, because we know they've been hugely secretive about pretty much everything, I think we're going to see there's been even more disgraces than ArriveCan out there in terms of blowing tons of money. Government employees who have a business on the side, and they're kind of giving themselves grants. You've got these kind of crown corporations. This Canada Investment Bank is just an absolute disgrace. It is a big waste of billions and billions of dollars. Governments say they have nowhere to save money. Oh, I can give you a list. I can give you a list right now that will save you many, many, many billions of dollars. But I think, again, that people seem to still, in Canada, I think we're very tolerant, overly tolerant of bad government because we still have kind of that happy thought of government being interested in our best outcomes and so on, which as we know, they're not. But once again, accountability. I actually spent a few years in my 20s working for the federal government. I was doing my master's degree at night at Carleton University, and I had to work because I wanted to eat and basic stuff like that. So I worked and I was studying economics, and so I actually got a job as an economist. And I remember I was like 21 or something. I was so delighted I had this job as an economist, and so I started working for this federal. It was actually the Competition Bureau. The department doesn't exist anymore. It was Consumer and Corporate Affairs. It was one of the ones that Trudeau #1 created when he was expanding government like mad. Yes. And the Sun has done exactly the same thing, as we know. And I was so disillusioned so fast by I called it the culture of sloth. It was terrible. And of course, it wasn't everybody. I mean, to be fair, of course, it wasn't everybody. But the sick days taken. We know government takes way more sick days than the private sector. There's no reason for that, except that they can. There's no accountability. There's no management that bothers saying
maybe
you're
it's
not
healthy,
sick.
Catherine. Maybe they're not as healthy.
Yeah, what a crock. That's absolute malarkey.
Okay.
But it's weird too. A lot of these sick days happen like after the Super Bowl and on Mondays and Fridays. It's a very odd coincidence. And it's consistent right across governments everywhere. It's abuse is what it is. And the reason they can abuse it is there's no accountability. There's no bottom line. In a business, if you have that kind of abuse going on, you're eventually not going to have a business anymore. You're eventually going to go under. Yeah. And so it can't be permitted. And there's all kinds. I mean, again, we've seen it in spades in the last little while. Why do we have all that trouble with passports? We had exactly the same number of employees. It wasn't as if there was some massive demand for passports. No, it was incompetence and lack of accountability. I don't think anybody's gotten fired. There were all kinds of disasters during the pandemic. For example, we're hearing now about all these ventilators that, hundreds of millions of dollars of ventilators that were thrown out as scrap. Wasted money, wasted our tax dollars while people are struggling to pay their grocery bill when they could have a lot more in their pockets if government was spending properly. Why did that happen? Who got fired because they took on a stupid contract like that? Nobody. So, I think this accountability issue with government is outrageous. I lived it myself, and from what I've observed, I've seen it. Worse now than I believe it was even back in the decades ago that I was actually working for them. And it's a terrible thing. And you're not spending your money either. When you're not spending your own money, hey, the sky's the limit, right? It's no constraints at all.
No, I think you're right, Catherine. And we almost need to take on a much more realistic and humble attitude towards the limits of government. If government is running everything, it's running everything poorly. It needs to focus on what it can do well in a limited way to free up citizens to be innovative, to work as community, to be able to do great things and build this country. That's the story of Canada.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think that's true,
Yeah. Well, you see now, I always like to say, stay in your lane. Stay in your lane, governments.
Stay in your lane.
Look at a municipal government. Okay, deal with the potholes. Let's have some water. Calgary's got a bit of an issue right now with that, and it turns out it's been neglected for years. But they have all kinds of time to get into all this gender ideology stuff and all this, critical race theory and all the climate junk that isn't even in there. It's not even in their jurisdiction to act on that kind of stuff. Same goes for every single level of government. Stay in your lane. Do what you're supposed to do. Get out of all this faddish frippery that they like to get into, and that costs us a lot of money and accomplishes nothing. That's the other thing. You look at it, and you mentioned, the government. You just have to look through history. I really wish sometimes everyone, and I know this is a tall order, but everyone could have a much better sense of history and how much big government has been destructive every single time it has happened.
Yes,
how much it throughout history, and how much it beggars your average citizen. And yet every time, and look at France right now. Look at France. The left decided to gang up on Marie Le Pen, and they, a lot of people dropped out of the race because they wanted their fellow lefty, who might not have been quite as far left or whatever. But now they've got this wacky coalition where they're talking about 90% tax levels on the so-called wealthy. Well, everybody
90%.
Everybody, that's what they're talking about. Everybody's on a plane out of France right now if you've got any success. And what that really means is penalizing success. Yes, you can point to a lot of rich people and say they didn't earn it. In fact, Trudeau is a classic in that category. He didn't earn all the dough. He was born, he had he won the genetic lottery, and a lot of people do. And such is life, such is life. I didn't happen to fall into that category, but a lot of people did, and good on them, I guess. But when you look at the people who work hard, who accomplish something, many of whom are independent, small, medium-sized business owners, and they're suddenly told they're tax cheats, with Trudeau, which Trudeau did very early in his reign, and that right off the bat, I thought, well, that speaks to how he thinks of half of the Canadian economy is small, medium-sized business, half, and employment. Most young people get their first job in a small business, for instance. So if you can wrongly, falsely diss half of the economy, then you haven't got your head screwed on right. I'm sorry, you just don't know the facts. You don't know how economies work, and of course, we're seeing all the results, aren't we? We're seeing all the things that I'm an economist, as you probably know, and you're seeing all the things that were predicted hundreds of years ago by economists with low productivity, overly high tax levels. In Canada right now, our lowest tax jurisdiction is Alberta, and that's our lowest. And in the U.S., their highest tax jurisdiction is California. Alberta is still higher than California. So our lowest jurisdiction in Canada is higher than the one that people are fleeing California because they can't afford it anymore. And yet, but that's our Canadian, that's our Canadian reality, where we have much more tolerance for high taxes than we should. Because from what I've seen in my many years in this business is if you give government more money, all it means is they got more money to piddle away. It doesn't mean, and we look at our healthcare. If you look at any international studies, we spend one of the highest amounts per capita in the world. And when they rank quality of outcomes in healthcare, we're around 26, 27, 28th right now. So if people say we got to spend more money, no, we don't have to spend more money. We have to fix the structure of the system.
Right on. Okay, so I did want to turn to another file. In fact, we've got a question from the audience about immigration as a solution to help business. So I do have this clip about immigration because it's a very interesting issue that people might find hard to believe.
Rocketing cost of living is difficult for both people who've lived in Canada for a long time and for newcomers. That means some people who chose to move to this country are now making other plans. CTV's Jumi Ogunshola reports tonight on the difficult decisions some immigrants are now making to leave.
Walking along the seawall, Malika Ezizi appears to have a great life, but there's something on her mind.
I'm sad even thinking about it, but it's a kind of must thing I feel now.
Ezizi arrived in Vancouver from Iran 6 years ago. But now she's seriously considering packing it up and moving on.
Every move that we want to make, the first and the only thing about is money.
But there's more.
I was an architect back in my home country. I went through the certifications.
But now, Ezizi is an intern architect. By the end of this year, Canada will have welcomed more than 450,000 new permanent residents, like Ezizi, with some form of foreign work experience. BC absorbs an estimated 20% of those numbers each year. But the system makes it difficult for most newcomers to transfer their foreign experience. A recent report is now highlighting a growing problem. Onward migration from Canada has jumped 31% in recent years. Azizi's story is not unique. Jack Strange moved to Vancouver from the UK about 2 years ago. He was very excited about the life ahead until he wasn't.
I was skipping meals, basically, because I was struggling to afford my food and my rent.
He is now back home. So where is the Canadian dream for newcomers?
Coming to Canada, purchasing a home, raising their families here, and that's definitely been brought into question.
The number of people leaving Canada is pale in comparison to those arriving, but over time it adds up.
We're going to continue to experience these issues with filling the labor needs.
For many, including Malika Ezizi, their Canadian dream is now neatly packed into their suitcase, waiting for the onward journey.
It's just sad. I think I wasted my life, kind of.
Jumi Ogunshola, CTV News.
So as we get in the home stretch of our conversation, you can see that even in immigration, where Canada has a record number of 1 million plus people coming to this country, Catherine, is the Canadian dream disappearing not only for immigrants, but frankly, the next generation?
Yeah. We could talk about this for an hour easily. We're just bringing too many people into the country to manage, period. It's no slight on immigrants. It is a stupid policy. We know that a lot of the problems with our housing market and the federal liberals love to say, oh, everyone in the world's having these problems. No, they are not. Our housing market is right out of control. You can go to the US, not very far away, and get a house for a third of what you'd pay in Canada.
Yes. Yeah.
We're also, again, taxing a new house. About 30% of it or so is tax. So that's another problem. Governments are, all the fees and permits and everything else, a massive chunk of that price you're paying is tax. But no, we're just bringing too many people into the country. And there's huge backlogs. I mean, our bureaucracy, such as it is, can't even handle all the numbers that we're bringing into Canada. Another thing that's happening, I think that woman Ezizi, there was a rare one. She actually had some relevant expertise. We're bringing a lot of unskilled people into Canada. And what they're doing is taking entry-level jobs away from young students and people that would normally be filling those jobs.
Interesting.
Kids are having a terrible time getting a summer job this year because of that factor. And that's not fair to anybody. It's not fair to the students. It's not fair to the immigrants either, because I doubt they wanted to come in and take an entry-level job, but that's all they could do because that's all that was available. Excuse me.
So Catherine, why is the government flooding the zone with this many immigrants and really undermining their own citizens then? In terms of the policy, why are they doing this?
Well, I think, and we haven't really got into this yet, but I think all of this, globalist, government and what we see coming out of the WEF, the World Economic Forum, and we see coming out of Mark Carney, people like that, their policies are destructive. They are known to reduce the standard of living of average people, and they're trying to impose this. These people were not elected. These are not elected people, and yet they're trying to impose their ideology again on the rest of us. This immigration thing, this open borders thing, Biden's doing it in the U.S. too, and he's part of his poll numbers being in the tank are because of the people flooding across the border. Roxham Road should never have happened in Canada. That was ludicrous. A lot of immigrants who have come to Canada. I'm a child of immigrants. My parents were not born in Canada. And many of us are, of course, but they followed the rules. They waited the period. They didn't cheat and come across the border at some Roxham Road like kind of entry point. That was ludicrous. That should never have been permitted to happen. And so and a lot of our immigrants are today are unvetted. That some of the people that are maddest are the people that did follow all the rules, and then they see others getting into the country not following the rules, not having requisite skills. And one thing the Trudeau government has done different than the Harper government is Harper had a much higher requirement for immigrants to have skills that were needed in Canada, to actually have skills. And yes, there was still family reunification, objectives as well. There were other objectives, but the Trudeau government has lowered that bar for people to come in with skill sets that we actually need in Canada, which is why we see so many of them in entry level, basically not very skilled jobs. So this has been messed up completely. But I think this open borders thing is very worrisome because we're not getting the vetting that we need. We've seen our crime rates up, and yeah, Trudeau has softened the penalties for criminals of various kinds. And my grandchildren are misbehaving right now, so they're going to get a big spanking when I get off. The call here.
So Catherine, am I being too cynical to suggest that perhaps one of the reasons why this kind of open approach to borders is happening in Canada is that they want to seek them as future voters? Is it that crass?
Oh no, there's definitely that factor too. And I mean, Pierre Trudeau was, Trudeau the first was a classic supporter of that kind of philosophy. But another thing I think is worth pointing out is that the baby boom generation, when Trudeau number one was in power, Trudeau number two has done a lot of stuff that his dad did. And it's had exactly the terrible results that his dad did as well. Massive debt, too much government, high tax levels, and so on. And we that financial crisis we had in the mid 1990s was because of Trudeau number one, because these bad policies, they creep up on you. They don't have an impact immediately. They have an impact 10 or 15 years later. So I think we're going to be in big trouble again financially as a country, with financiers not wanting to invest in us at all and invest in our government debt, just like we did in about 1995. So yeah, a part of it is votes, definitely, but I think part of it is also to be disruptive. And the criminal element, there were some recent stats I saw where an inordinate number of people that had been let into Canada with very little oversight at all had active criminal records. And we've seen this, people that don't even have the disaster we have now on our streets with all this pro-Hamas garbage going on and disrupting people and disrupting neighborhoods and so on. And governments are disgraceful for not dealing with that. But a lot of that going on, there are certain leaders there that didn't even have valid passports and yet were permitted to become citizens of Canada. Wow. There is just such awful things, and that should bother every single Canadian, immigrant or otherwise.
Yeah, so you're really challenging us to think incisively and critically about these policies, about who's serving whom, and whether they're just for short-term political opportunism, or are they really serving the citizens of this country? It's just really disturbing. So as we end our conversation...
Yeah, the federal Liberals, though, they seem to, they're very condescending, even though they're not very smart or experienced. They really seem to think they have the right, and recently, I think it was Anita Anand, their Treasury Board minister, who said that Canadians weren't thinking right. And they had to tell us how to think, because Pardon me? Government is supposed to be the servant of the people, not imposing some, crackpot thinking on the average people. And yet that's what this government has been doing consistently. I think initially people wanted to do the right thing. They were kind of, they were kind of conned into, if you said something wrong, you were a racist or a sexist or a homophobe, or, you were called some name and you thought, oh, can't do that. But people were not. Canadians actually are some of the least racist, sexist, and homophobic in the world, I would say. And yet, people were cowed. They were silenced by these kinds of accusations. But I think now the reason the worm is turning is because we're seeing people realize this is hurting me and my family. And when it hits you where you live, then you're going to act.
I think you're right, Catherine. So I'm wondering if we turn to action now and solutions. I mean, we know that this is a tough environment for businesses to thrive, and that ultimately hurts Canadians. But it also relates to, again, culture, our way of thinking. And one of the things I'm sensing, Catherine, is so much of this crazy way of thinking, like the whole idea that money grows on trees. Some call it modern monetary theory. You've got this whole fetish obsession with victimization, right? Like, you think of this crackpot thinking that, things all relate to your racial identity and not merit. Is the fountainheads, the origins for a lot of that thinking relates to our education system, in fact, our universities. Have you thought about that issue and how we need to reform those education systems? Like, why are we even giving them these universities? I mean, you see example after example in Canada now, where it's just pathetic, where you have obviously a lot of good programs in universities, but you even have medical schools that are introducing so-called political tests, diversity, equity, inclusion tests. You have it filtering right into all these kind of professional organizations. I mean, it is really disturbing. And this is antithetical to building a strong economy and a fair society, I would say, a just society based on merit and truth-seeking, rather than this ideology that's kind of undermining and ruining this country. What do you think?
Yeah, well, the whole leftist thing is interesting because merit is bad, apparently. And this all is of a piece. This is all the same kind of thinking that the unions in Canada and most union members in Canada work for government, not the private sector. It's the unionization in the private sector has been plummeting, and because they're not competitive. And yet yes, we the taxpayer, we the private sector taxpayer pay more and more and more taxes for these big awards of compensation and rich pensions and all the goodies in the public sector, who retire earlier than us, work fewer hours per week. I mean, there's been a lot of studies done on that situation, and that's ridiculous. At a minimum, it should be equal in the public and private sector, and it's not. It's the compensation in the public sector is anywhere from about 25 to 40% higher for comparable jobs.
Very high.
If you factor in things like pensions and stuff, which are huge, like the public sector pensions are massive. But yeah, it's infected our schools. I would say right from the grade one. I mean, I have two sons, and I spent quite a long time, deprogramming them. and the situation today, like I said, my grandkids are here and happily behaving right at the moment, but they'll be my next project, because it's way worse now than it was when my kids were growing up in terms of the indoctrination and the lefty. And when you're taking all kinds of time to learn about things like, to how to be a social justice warrior instead of how to do math and problem solving and literacy and all that kind of stuff, that means you are not being equipped with the skills every person needs to have a successful life. And that's what we're betraying our kids by all this stupidity that's happening in the schools. And actually, our group is doing quite a bit of work in the education system. And there's I talked about healthcare earlier. There's another area that we spend a ton of money on, our education system. Our teachers are extremely well compensated, all the whining they do, notwithstanding, and can retire as early as 55 with a very generous pension that we all kick into, and they sure don't kick into my pension. So that's not a very equal situation. So, we see this kind of indoctrination, but again, I think the pendulum is starting to swing back. I really do, because people are seeing the impacts of it. They're seeing the effect on their kids and their grandkids and so on, and they don't like it. And they're realizing, you can call me whatever you can, sticks and stones, you can break my bones, but names are never going to hurt me. So call me a racist, call me whatever you want, but it doesn't matter, because the interests of my kids, my grandkids, my family are more important than some stupid ideological thing. And so I think we've seen parent marches. Parents are quite ticked off with what's happening in the schools, how foolish it is, and universities. Well, I think governments should be cutting off the tax flow is what they should be doing to universities. Something interesting we heard from a whole bunch of our members, our business members, recently, was that they would prefer to hire people out of high school as opposed to university, because they would skip a lot of the indoctrination that way. So they'd rather take somebody, train them, and then employ them on that basis than have them go through. They're already partially indoctrinated. The public school system is that way. But that's also why we shouldn't have a government monopoly there. A number of provinces, as you probably know, have charter schools that tend to be specialized often in a particular school set, maybe math, maybe some technology, who knows, science, could be all kinds of different things. And that's what we should have in Ontario, where I am, for example. We don't have charter schools, and I don't know why the Ford gang don't set them up, because they don't only offer another option, they also tend to bring up the standards of the public schools, because the public schools realize suddenly they have to compete with somebody, and competition is always a good thing.
I would agree with you, Catherine. It strikes me that often again, and you can see this on the Frontier website again and again, this should be about the theme of empowering people to live the lives that they want to lead. So don't give the money to a woke bureaucracy at a university or a school. Give the money to the parents, and they choose where you send your child in terms of education. There's so many great solutions.
That's the freedom thing, David. That gets down to freedom. Why shouldn't we have the freedom to choose? We're paying for it. It's our tax dollars. And why should we not have the freedom to choose? All kinds of different things. There's public sector monopolies are invariably bad. I've always said the three most deadly words are unionized public monopoly, because it never works for the majority of people.
Well, that's great. So as we look to a possible new federal government, Catherine, what would be some of the key actions that the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses would recommend in terms of policy for a new government to create a better Canada?
Well, it's a very long list, but number one would be shrink government. Government's right out of control. And we need to shrink it. It would take some time. You're not going to do it overnight, obviously. But that would be number one on the agenda. At the same time, improving accountability measures within government, getting rid of business subsidies. People think business likes subsidies. No, business hate true businesses, true competitive businesses hate subsidies, because successful businesses know that their tax dollars go to that stupid EV plant, which is going to be useless in 5 years, if you ask me, or that incompetent entrepreneur, but who happens to fit maybe a certain profile that the government likes. Is it a racial group? Is it a gender thing? Whatever you want to. Right. Maybe it's a regional thing or whatever. But it doesn't go toward a successful business. It goes towards somebody that needs the government money, which means you're not a successful business, basically. So I would say there's a lot of areas to shrink government. Number two would be to revitalize our energy industry. Our energy industry is our golden egg that we should be encouraging, not discouraging. To add to it, that'll ramp our productivity up in and of itself. We need to have a total tax reform system as well in Canada. Our whole, whether it's corporate or personal, it's all right out of whack. It needs a serious, probably a royal commission, or even though I hate to say that, but it probably needs something of that magnitude to deal with that. And again, on the freedom side, we haven't even talked censorship. This government is trying to censor us on the internet. Yes. They're trying to control the media, get rid of those media subsidies. We'll save a whack of money and let the industry settle. It'll settle out one way or the other. Every industry ultimately does. And the people that are successful will prevail. Those that aren't won't. And unfortunately, that's the real world. So that's just a start, really. I could have a much longer list, but there's a few big priorities.
Well, I love your list as I counted them of 6. I like it. Shrink the size of government. Let's streamline those regulations, get the energy sector back on track, and a bunch of others. So, Catherine, this has been a delightful conversation. We've covered a lot of very important ground about why business and manufacturing is important and how difficult it is. And it's really bad public policy that's hurting every Canadian. So, Catherine, I want to thank you for joining us and for the audience's questions. And I certainly wish you every success with your team at the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Business of Canada.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
So that brings to an end our program today. We're glad that you could join us. And same time next week on Thursday. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.